Hello, fellow students of history. This lecture concerns the early English colonies and what will become the United States of America. This lecture follows on the heels of a previous lecture concerning the early colonies in what was New Spain. In this lecture, we will cover major dates, key players, and some original source documents I think really help us delve into the mentality of the age that we're studying. Colonial America, the English colonies. In the previous lecture, we went over some of the major differences between the Spanish enterprise in New Spain and the English enterprise in New England and the early colonies in what will become the United States of America. So please, if you haven't gone over those major differences between the Spaniards in New Spain and Mexico and the English, please do so. Here are some key dates, and I'll briefly go over these. In 1600, now this is 108 years after Columbus, and 71 years after Cortez lands at Veracruz to conquer the Aztec Empire. 1600, English merchants found the East India Company, exploiting trade with India and breaking the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly of the East Indian spice trade. 1606, the first Virginia charter issued by King James I of England, creating the Virginia Company. This is the same King James where we get the King James Bible. This begins the colonial America period. 1607, the first colony founded at Jamestown, Virginia. 1619, the first African slaves arrived at Jamestown, Virginia, to aid in tobacco cultivation. 1620 to 1640, the Great Migration of thousands of English to the Americas. Now, 1640, something monumental happens in the English colonies. Although African slaves were there in 1619, John Punch becomes the first African that we know of to be sentenced to a life of servitude. John Punch was originally an indentured servant, and he is sentenced to a life of servitude, the first Black man in the colonies. And from this point on, slavery, lifelong slavery, will evolve for Africans in the English colonies until we have full-blown slavery by the end of the century. And that will carry on, of course, until 1865, the end of the Civil War, and the passage of the 13th Amendment that outlaws slavery. So John Punch, the first African to be sentenced to a life of slavery. Slavery will last from 1640 to 1865. Immigration into the US. Now, although we are studying the Puritans and Pilgrims and Quakers, this idea of immigration is a major thread throughout the American tapestry. And I often refer to the metaphor of a tapestry, but you can create your own metaphor in your mind to better understand the American experience. And immigration is a major thread in this great tapestry. And it begins with the English in the colonies. Why do people leave their homes? What causes Puritans and Pilgrims and Irish and German in the 19th century and Chinese and Mexicans, Filipinos, and across the board? What causes someone to leave their home? A home they cherish, that's been in their families for generations, perhaps centuries. The land that is in their blood and perhaps even in their DNA. People at this time do not willingly leave their home. Something pushes them out. Think about what it was like to immigrate at this time. This wasn't just this wasn't travel. You go to the airport, show your passport, get on a plane, and rest for a few hours, and you're in a new country. This was dangerous. It was filled with anxiety and fear, and perhaps even starvation and shipwreck. You may not ever reach your destination, and once you have reached your destination, it's a totally new environment. Everything must be made from scratch. And for the first few colonists who came over from England, many died because there wasn't a Home Depot to go buy supplies. There wasn't a grocery store. Everything, absolutely everything, had to be made, caught, grown, killed, woven, cooked from scratch. Think about that. How many things in your life are made from scratch? Probably virtually nothing, unless you have a farm and you grow your own food and you cook your own food. Your clothes, your food, your books, everything that we have is, most things that we own now are made by other people, most often by slaves in China. But at this time, everything was made at home by hand. So let's read this out. When dealing with immigration, there are factors pushing people out of their places of origin and factors pulling immigrants to American shores. Historically, people do not willingly or happily leave their places of birth, where their families have lived for generations, even centuries. Unless you are 100% Native American, at one time your ancestors made this heavy decision to kiss their family goodbye and hop a ship for America. Perhaps your ancestor traveled alone at 13 years of age. Before the advent of modern communications and travel, immigration journeys constituted a risk of disease, destitution, even death, not to mention never seeing your homeland and family ever again. Immigrants could not board a plane and visit their family back home on the holidays, or pick up a phone and call their relatives back in Ireland. The cutoff was often absolute. Think about the kind of factors that push people out of their home countries. What would it take for you to leave the US for a foreign shore, where you might not speak the language or anyone or know anyone in the new host nation? In addition, why did a majority of immigrants venture to the US when numerous other nations in the Western Hemisphere welcomed immigrants at the same time? Now, at this time, of course, during the Puritans and Pilgrims, it wasn't so easy. But as we go further in time into the 19th century and 20th century, there are other nations that immigrants could go to. But why the US? Why do they pick the US oftentimes? What was pulling immigrants to the US in 1820, in 1850, in 1870? So there are pull factors and push factors. Push factors in their nations of origin and pull factors that are pulling people to the United States, and at this time, the English colonies, or the New World. Before they were the English colonies, it was a New World. Push factors. Persecution, and this certainly was the case with the first immigrants who came to the New World and created the English colonies. They were persecuted by the king, and they fled to this new world to worship God how they saw fit. Wars at home often are push factors. During the Mexican Revolution, around 25% of Mexicans leave Mexico and cross the border because the violence was just too much. A whole decade of violence. Think about this. Fresno and Clovis enduring 10 years of warfare. It's just too much for people to bear, and they want to live in a safe environment, away from violence, send their kids to school without the fear of them getting shot, and open businesses without the fear of armies taking them over. Wars at home. Famine, starvation, of course, as humans, our basic instinct is to eat. That's one of them to survive, right? We can't go more than a month or so without eating. And take Ireland, for example, during the Irish famine, um, Irish were starving. There were dead Irish everywhere. And many young people hopped ships to come to the United States in the 19th century to flee that starvation. But not only Ireland, many nations around the world where people have starved over the last couple of centuries have boarded ships and made for the United States. No work at home. In order to feed one's family, men and women need to work to feed their children. And when there's no work, oftentimes people go hungry. And if they go hungry for too long, they start to starve to death. And the English colonies, the New Republic after 1776, and the United States has often been a beacon of hope for work. Economic opportunities start with having a job. Fleeing a tyrannical government. Tyrants, dictators are oppressive and stymie rights and often lead to all of these other things. Persecutions, wars, famines, and no work are often factors in a nation where a tyrant or dictator is in charge. Now look at North Korea, right? Or the Soviet Union under Stalin. Many of these things were happening. Pull factors. So these are push factors, pushing people out of their homeland, and there have traditionally been pull factors pulling people to the United States. Freedom of religion, other freedoms. This certainly was the case again with the Puritans and Pilgrims and Quakers who were persecuted by a tyrant at home in England. And they wanted to get to the New World to own their own piece of property, farm their own land, and practice God how they thought God would want it to be worshipped, freely without the fear of death or imprisonment. Economic prosperity. So if there's no work at home in your nation of origin, your country of origin, there's no work. Well, the hope is that once you come to the United States or the English colonies, you will have work, and work leads to economic prosperity, eating well, clothing your family, and living a prosperous life. And on a lesser degree, simply adventure and youthful interest. I've read many journals and eyewitness accounts of immigrants coming to the United States for the last 200 years, and some of them simply say, I wanted to see the US. I heard about this and my imagination was stoked and I was excited, and I left my family and I boarded a ship because I had a sense of adventure. Now this pull factor is to a far less degree, but it is present. Can you think of other reasons people might leave their home countries and come to the United States? Now, what motivated the Puritans, Quakers, and Pilgrims to originally settle what would become New England? Now, I think we've already talked about this. I kind of gave it away. What were the pull factors and push factors that motivated these peoples to cross the dangerous Atlantic, where some of them lost their lives? Religion. It's very important to keep in mind that religion saturated every feature of the lives of these people. Religion, pleasing God, living a godly life. Inwardly and outwardly in your community. Living your life so others can see that you are a chosen of God. Religion is a huge factor in this time period. Push factor, persecution. Pull factor, freedom to practice religion, free from persecution. and to own and farm their own land. Now, keep in mind that when the Puritans first come over, their vision is not to create an oasis of freedom for all peoples with different beliefs and diverse religions. They're coming over to practice what Puritans believed based in Calvinism. And like many Christian denominations, they believed that their way was the only way. And others were practicing religion erroneously or in opposition to God. Well, this is the way they viewed the Catholics. So the Puritans are coming over and the Pilgrims to practice what they believe is the true religion, free from the persecution of the English church and crown. Now let's read this document together, the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower was the ship the Pilgrims used to sail to the New World. And in 1620, those aboard the Mayflower drew up this document and signed it. It really is a precursor to American democracy in many ways. It's very short documents. Agreement between the settlers at New Plymouth, 1620. In the name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Do by these presents, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the reign of our sovereign Lord King James, of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domini, 1620. And signed by these pilgrims aboard the Mayflower. Now, the Pilgrims are those people who are aboard the Mayflower. And the Pilgrims have, most of their beliefs are similar or the same as the Puritans, as I'll go on to explain. But the Pilgrims are separatists. They're more radical than the Puritans. The Puritans believed that, well, let's say both the Puritans and Pilgrims believed that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was filled with erroneous Catholic elements. And they believed that the Catholic Church was in opposition to God. And many reformers believed the Pope was the Antichrist and the Catholic Church, the great whore of Babylon, mentioned in Revelation. And so they both believed this, that there were elements in the Anglican Church that were in opposition to God. It was just too Catholic. The Puritans believed that the Anglican Church could be purified of those Catholic elements and still align themselves with the Anglican Church. The Pilgrims believed the Anglican Church was too far gone, that those Catholic elements were in opposition to God, and that because there was no saving the Anglican Church, and they wanted to separate themselves And that was the reason they were coming to the New World, to separate themselves physically and spiritually from England and the Anglican Church and start something completely new. And this was the Pilgrims. The Puritans, English who believed the English Church, Anglican Church, also now called the Episcopalian Church, should and could be purified. Now, we often erroneously believe the Puritans are called Puritans because they lived puritanical lives. They did lead, this is where we get the word puritanical from the Puritans. They did lead very strict Spartan lives in accordance to their religion, but this is not why they were called Puritans. They believed the English church should and could be purified and reformed from the inside. They originally did not want to break away from the church. This is how many reformers saw themselves. Remember, the Catholic Church was the Christian church for the first, say, 1,500 years in Europe. The Pope ruled in many ways, in most time periods, he ruled as a type of emperor. Certainly the religious emperor, at times also the temporal emperor here on earth. So many reformers, even when they broke away, they still considered themselves part of the Catholic Church, or here part of the Anglican Church. Martin Luther, until his very last days, still saw himself as Catholic. So did King Henry VIII, because they were so steeped in the idea that the Catholic Church was the mother church. And although they wanted to reform it, they couldn't mentally and spiritually completely break away until their dying days. Persecuted by King Charles in England, they fled to find a new home in the New World. They adopted the beliefs of John Calvin while protesting many of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. And again, that's what the word Protestant means, a reformer who protested the Catholic Church. Both Puritans and Pilgrims were one of the first groups to settle in New England. Pilgrims. Pilgrims refer specifically to those English people aboard the Mayflower, and who were the early settlers of Plymouth, Massachusetts. The Pilgrims were not Puritans in the strict sense that they did not believe that the Church of England could be purified. The Pilgrims are referred to as separatists, and who were influential under Oliver Cromwell in England. The Pilgrims sought to establish their own unique churches away from the Church of England. Both Puritans and Pilgrims believed the Anglican Church had too many Catholic influences, and the Pope and Rome were the great evils to both groups. Many reformers thought the Pope was the Antichrist and Rome the great whore of Babylon in Revelation. Quakers, or the Society of Friends. Quakers. Although smaller in number than the Puritan immigrants, the Quakers made a powerful impact on American colonial history and culture. While the Puritans relied heavily on the Old Testament and biblically based rules that governed a strict moral and lifestyle code, the Quakers believed in a more loose interpretation of the scriptures, relying on personal revelation and the Holy Spirit. The two belief systems of the Puritans and Quakers often clashed, with the latter receiving harsh and brutal punishments from the Quakers. Many Quakers underwent medieval-style torture, had limbs chopped off, and were executed by the Puritans, who believed the Quakers were led by heresy or false doctrine, false revelation. A great number of Quakers settled in Rhode Island due to the colony's culture of religious toleration. Quakers were persecuted in England and New England by Puritans. And here are some points about the Quakers I'll let you read on your own. Indentured servants. In the early part of the 1600s, white slavery, although Africans also served as indentured servants, referred to as indentured servitude, provided a major portion of the labor force in New England. Poor English, Scottish, and Irish made up the majority of these servants, signing a contract for so many years of labor in return for passage to the New World. 20 of the 104 pilgrims to arrive on the Mayflower were indentured servants. This practice continued until the late 1600s and early 1700s, when African slavery took over the great portion of labor. Indentured servitude was created and introduced by the Virginia Company in 1619 due to a need for cheap labor. The passage across the Atlantic cost more than half a year's wage for the English and a whole year's wage for the average German. So many paid with a contract for their labor. The persons selling their bodies for labor signed contracts with British merchants. These contracts were then sold to the highest bidder once in the New World. Between 50 and 75% of all Europeans who arrived during the colonial era were indentured. That's a lot of indentured servants. Most indentured servants were poor Irish and Scottish young people. Keep in mind that the Irish and Scots were a different type of people than the English Puritans who bought their contracts. These poor indentured young people were often mistreated. Here's a map showing the 13 colonies and the proclamation line of 1763. Here's a map showing the 13 colonies again and the predominant ethnic groups in the colonies. Of course, African, Dutch, English, German, Scots, Irish, Scots, Swedish, and Welsh. So predominantly, right, the United Kingdom, the British, Great Britain, and Dutch and German, and of course, Africans who were brought over as slaves. And a map, the 13 colonies map again, showing the proclamation line of 1763, and the predominant religions or denominations, because it's all the Christian religion, right? These are predominant denominations in the 13 colonies in 1750. Of course, the most dominant is Anglican Church, or another name now, of course, is Episcopalian Church, all in green. This is the Church of England. Congregational up in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. This is the denomination of the Pilgrims and Puritans. The Lutheran Church in light purple. This is the church started by Martin Luther, who was a Catholic monk to begin with, a German Catholic monk, who saw great evils that he perceived in the Catholic Church and reformed the church in Germany that became the Lutheran Church, its own denomination, and broke away from the Catholic Church. Presbyterian in a light kind of, I'm not sure what that color is, pink. I know you're going to correct me, some of you, that's not pink, is it? And of course, these churches are still in existence today. And to a lesser extent, Baptist, Roman Catholic, and Jewish. Let's take a look at these numbers. Called the starving times, the crude death rate the first winter. In Jamestown, 638 out of 1,000 died. In Plymouth, 490 per 1,000. What was it like to have been there? Think about this, 490 out of 1,000. Shivering cold, deathly cold, without food, away from home, away from your mother, in a strange land, and people around you are dying, and you're about to die. I'll read this out. Try to imagine the tremendous physical hard work and mental strain the early colonists endured. Absolutely everything had to be made from raw materials, and most died. Examine these statistics and what they meant for the human experience. This is far different than making the little Puritan hats in kindergartens. This is understanding the human condition in history, life and death, humanity. Far from home, in a strange land, with little to no food, clothing, or shelter. The next segment at the bottom, child mortality in New England. 180 to 200 of every 1,000 died the first year after birth. Think of the great sorrow in these places. As 25 up to 25% of the kids are dying. Wow. Examine the below numbers. The infant mortality numbers for girls is far higher than that for boys. What do you think? Think about this. Why did infant girls die in a far greater number than boys? Keep in mind, this does not reflect newborns only, but children throughout the early stages of life, when life is tenuous and fragile unless given much care, right? Because humans are basically fetuses when they're born still. Think of other mammals when they're born. They come out as miniature adults. You ever watched a documentary on African mammals, right? And a giraffe gives birth. That little giraffe comes out as basically a little adult. In no time, it's up and running away. Humans still are going through a maturation process as after we're born, and we need great care. What was it about girls and boys in that early colonial society that witnessed so many more girls dying and so many more boys living? What do you think? Look at the numbers below. Death rate for infants in Salem, Massachusetts, 17th century, 18th century. In the 17th century, 313 girls per 1,000 are dying, compared to far lesser numbers, 202 boys per 1,000. A whole 100 more girls. In the 18th century, the numbers are even higher, which is odd. Why is this? At birth, I think boys and girls are dying at the same rate, right? Because girls don't have a proclivity for death in greater numbers than boys. It's the care shown to them. It's the resources given to them, the mother's milk given to them, the food given, the care, the nurturing, the attention. Why? I'll let you think about that. What do you think? Here's a poem written by Anne Bradstreet, because so many children are dying. In memory of my dear grandchild. Let's read this out. Her grandchild just died. 3 of Bradstreet's grandchildren died as infants, Anne being the second. With troubled heart, in trembling hand I write, the heavens have changed my sorrow to delight. How oft with disappointment have I met, when on fading things my hopes have set. Experience might for this have made me wise, to value things according to their price. Was ever stable joy yet found below, or perfect bliss without a mixture of woe? I knew she was but a withering flower, that's here today, perhaps gone in an hour. Like as a bubble, or the brittle glass, or like a shadow turning as it was, more full than I to look on what was lent, as if mine own, when thus impermanent. Farewell, dear child, thou never shalt come to me, but yet a while, and I shall go to thee. Meantime, my throbbing heart's cheered up with this, thou with my Savior art in endless bliss. More numbers. Examine the numbers below. What factors might account for the rise in both population from 1640 to 1770 and the higher rate of surviving children from the colonial period to 1900? What do you think these rising numbers constitute? What's happening in the culture and society to answer for these rising numbers? And the rising numbers of children surviving their formative years. The religion the Puritans observed, their strain of Christianity, had a strong foundation in Calvinism, the teachings of John Calvin, a reformer from Geneva, who lived from 1509 to 1564. And these are the basic tenets that John Calvin taught. And you can see much of this, or all of this, religious philosophy in the sermons, the preachings of the Puritans. Total depravity. Human beings are totally evil. We're all totally evil. We're all going to hell. We're all sinners. This is what John Calvin preached. Born sinners because of Adam and Eve's sin of disobeying God in the Garden of Eden. God is all. Humans are nothing and the source of all evil in the world. How do you feel now? Unconditional election. Although not obligated to do so, God has chosen to save, elect certain people with no reference to their lives or works. In fact, he knows beforehand who will be elected to go to heaven. This is called predestination. So every human born is totally evil and doesn't deserve the love of God. Now God, although he's not obligated to do so, has handpicked particular people to live with him forever in eternity. But nobody knows who that is, and no one knows if they're saved for eternal life. And God has not hand-chosen the elect based on anything that they've done or not done. Just because and this is a mystery, why God has handpicked certain people and not certain people. But this is predestination. You can go crazy with this idea. I'm trying to wrap your mind around it. And I'm sure certain Puritans did. Limited atonement. Christ did not die for everyone, but only for the elect. Irresistible grace. God's grace is freely given by him to the elect, not everyone, but only to those chosen people who have done nothing to deserve it, who may live lives of sin and total depravity, but God has chosen them anyway, and you cannot understand that. And can neither be earned nor refused. Grace is God's saving power to redeem and save us through the forgiveness of sins, newness of life, the power to resist temptation, and the peace in mind and heart. Perseverance of the saints. God gives the elect the full power to do God's will and live uprightly to the end of their lives. So the elect have done nothing to deserve their election. It's only God's grace. But the elect will be known outwardly by their works, even though no one who is alive knows for sure if they're the elect or not. But those who lived, I suppose, perfect lives bear the fruits of their election, if you can wrap your minds around that. Indentured servants. I love these ads. These are original source documents. And I'll let you read this one on your own. Indentured servants ad. So these indentured servants are arriving in a ship, and this is an ad to go buy their contracts. And we'll read these out right here, because I transcribed these from the original source documents so you can read them. August 19th, 1762, to be sold, an Irish woman servant who has 3 years and 3 months to serve. Inquire at the new printing office. Now, most often, generally, the average term of service is around 7 years. And some of them are less and some are more, but the average is around 7. October 29th, 1766, to be disposed of, 2 Irish servant boys' times, the one having 6, the other 7 years to serve, and are suitable either for town or country business. The above servants' times are disposed of for no fault, but only for lack of employment. So he's saying these are 2 boys. They're not being sold because they're unruly, because they're brats, but because they just need work. There's no work for them here, but they need to have some work. For further particulars, inquire of William Parr, Esquire, or the subscriber. August 10th, 1738. Just arrived from Dublin in the snowed Jolly Bacchus, Peter Cullen, commander, a parcel of likely English and Irish servants, tradesmen, shoemakers, tailors, weavers, black and white smiths, carpenters, husbandmen means farmers, and sundry other tradesmen. Also a parcel of likely servant women, fit for either town or country work, whose times are to be disposed of by Thomas Walker, butcher, or Samuel Walker, or John Beaumont, or the said master on board the Ade Snow, now laying off against Market Street Wharf, where all due attendance will be given. 1738. Now let you read the rest. An Irish girl, a servant girl's time to be disposed of, having about 2 years and 4 months to serve, is very fit for coarse work, spins exceeding well, and would do for country business. For terms apply to James Plunkett, the sign of Artsop in the Shades in Walnut Street, Philadelphia. Now, think about this. The people who are buying these contracts are wealthy Englishmen, Englishwomen. The people who are indenturing themselves are children and teens, mostly children and teens, Irish and Scots, who the English look down on anyway. The English consider the Irish dogs. So you can imagine the abuse that went on. You have a 13-year-old Irish girl all alone, and a man from the countryside buys her. I won't go into details, but you can imagine the abuse that went on. And I'm sure it did, because many of these kids run away. Indentured servant runaway ad. Runaway from James Whitall of Red Bank, Gloucester County, an Irish servant girl named Mary Henny, short and thick. Had on when she went away a lightish colored jacket, an old black quilt, brownish striped petticoat, blue yarn stockings, and neat leather shoes with buckles in them. Whoever takes up and secures the said servant, so as her master may have her again, and you can read into that, what I'm reading into that, so her master may have her again, shall have 30 shillings rewards, and reasonable charges paid by James Whitall. And look at this subscript. Any person that conceals the said servant shall be prosecuted as the law directs. This is a powerful statement of power, of perhaps abuse. There's a reason why this Irish girl is running away. Mary Henny. I hope Mary Henny lived a long life and found happiness and got away from this man. But that's my own personal thoughts. That won't be on the test. I'll let you read this also. There's a few of these Irish servants who ran away together. More runaway ads. I'll read the first one. Run away from the subscribers on Sunday the 17th instant, an Irish servant man named Daniel Downs, about 30 years of age. And the way these English masters describe them is often in disparaging terms, right? We read Mary Henny, short and thick. Not very flattering, perhaps even for that time period. I think you get a glimpse into how they viewed these people. This is before, actually it's not. This is concurrent with African slavery. So as African slavery is on the rise in numbers, white indentured servitude is on the decrease, but for many decades they were occurring at the same time. Daniel Downs, about 30 years of age, a thick, clumsy fellow, had on when he went away a brown-colored coat, well-worn, mixed linsey jacket, striped linen trousers, blue and white yarn stockings, old shoes, check shirt, and a felt hat. Went off with him the same day Johannes Glan, an Irish servant lad, about 5 feet 9 inches high, a slim fellow, red complexion, had on when he went away a blue broadcloth coat, a striped linen jacket, Ozenbrigg shirt and trousers, shoes and stockings. Whoever takes up said servants, so that their masters may have them again, shall have 20 shillings reward if taken in the province, and out of it 40 shillings paid by Johannes Glan, William Queeling. Some important historical actors from this time I want you to know. King Charles I. I'll quickly go through these. You can research them on your own if you'd like. King Charles I. John Winthrop, a leading Puritan leader during this time period. He wrote City Upon a Hill, very influential in the formation of the Puritan colonies. City Upon a Hill, a foundational document in American history. And let's read this. John Winthrop, A City Upon a Hill, one of the foundational expressions of American exceptionalism. Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities. For the supply of other necessities, we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our community as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us. When 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that this is the famous phrase right here, one of the foundations of American thought. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and our professors for God's sake. This is straight from the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament, this is language that God uses against Israel if they go astray. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. And to shut up this discourse with that exhortation of Moses, that faithful servant of the Lord in his last farewell to Israel, Deuteronomy 30. Beloved, there is now set before us life and good, death and evil, and that we are commanded this day to love the Lord our God and to love one another, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his ordinance and his laws and the articles of our covenant with him, that we may live and be multiplied, and that the Lord our God may bless us in the land whither we go to possess it. But if our hearts shall turn away, so that we will not obey, but shall be seduced and worship other gods, our pleasures and profits, and serve them, it is propounded unto us this day, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this vast sea to possess it. Therefore, let us choose life, that we and our seed may live, by obeying his voice and cleaving to him, for he is our life and our prosperity. Roger Williams, one of my favorite early Puritan leaders, a Puritan minister, theologian, and author who founded the colony of Rhode Island in Providence plantations. A strong advocate for religious freedom. He's very progressive for his time period. He advocated the separation of church and state and just fair dealings with American Indians. He actually lived amongst American Indian tribes and to get to better know them and learn their language and ways and customs. An amazing man, forward-thinking man. Rhode Island became a refuge for those seeking religious freedom. William Penn, founder of the province of Pennsylvania. His democratic principles helped inspire the U.S. Constitution. Anne Hutchinson, another one of my favorite figures, a woman who spoke up in church, who clashed with Puritan leaders, who at that time, women, as in many churches throughout Christian history, women could not speak in church. Men were the leaders. The Quakers didn't believe in pastors. The Quakers practiced a religion where women and men had equal say, and women could prophesy in the Quaker church as well as men, but not so in the Puritan churches. Women had to keep silence. They couldn't teach. She was having house meetings at home and teaching doctrine that was different than what the Puritans taught, and she was outcast. She eventually went to Roger Williams, Rhode Island, and there was able to practice her religion freely without persecution by the Puritan leadership. The following original source document really gives us a window into the strong moral code the Puritans lived under. And remember, these are people who killed young women, who hanged them during the Salem witch trials. Very controlled society, controlled by Puritan pastors. Very strict moral code. The execution of Mary Latham, 1641. Read the following original source document concerning the trial and execution of a young Puritan woman named Mary Latham. Examine carefully. What might this document tell us about 1641 Puritan culture? As critical thinkers of history, what questions do we need to ask of the document itself? So there's the historical moment, right? And then there's the document that offers us a window into the historical moment. When we read the document, we have to ask ourselves critical questions. Who is writing this document? Who are they? What informs their view of history? Do they have an agenda in writing this document? Why are they writing it down? For simply historical reasons as a chronologist? Or are they writing a moral lesson to teach the people of their time period and subsequent generations not to commit sin? We have to ask ourselves these things, especially if a Puritan leader is writing this down. We have to be critical. So somewhere in there, there's a kernel of truth. There's an event that took place. But we have to filter that through the eyes of a Puritan leader, and perhaps he is embellishing on particular aspects of the event to teach a moral lesson. What caveats do we need to be aware of when examining this account? And this is the account. And John Winthrop describes this account. At this court of assistance, one James Britton, a man ill-affected both to our church and discipline and civil government, and one Mary Latham, a proper young woman about 18 years of age, whose father was a godly man and had brought her up well, were condemned to die for adultery. This woman, being rejected by a young man whom she had affection unto, vowed she would marry the next that came to her, and accordingly, against her friends' minds, she matched with an ancient man who had neither honesty nor ability, and one whom she had no affection for. So she was heartbroken. The young man she loved broke her heart, and she said, okay then, forget you. I'm going to marry the first man that comes my way. So the first man that came her way was an old curmudgeon who was not honest, and it says no ability, so he probably didn't have the ability to have sex with her or love her, and he was just an old guy. Whereupon, soon after she was married, several young men solicited her chastity, and drawing her into bad company, giving her wine and other gifts, easily prevailed with her, and among others this Briton. But God, smiting him with a deadly palsy and a fearful horror of conscience, he could not keep secret. So she's married to this old guy. He's not satisfying her in any way, mentally, sexually, spiritually. And these other young guys come to her yard. Hey, come party with us. We have some wine. We have some tobacco. She goes out and party. She's only 18 years old. She's getting her party on. And one of the guys, he can't take it. He's full of conviction. He's guilty. And he goes to the pastors and tells on Mary and tells on his friends. The woman dwelt now in Plymouth Patent, and one of the magistrates there, one of the pastors, hearing she was wanted by us, sent her to us. Upon her examination, she confessed he did attempt the fact, but did not commit it. And witness was produced that testified that in the evening of a day of humiliation through the country for England, a company met at Britton's and there continued drinking till late in the night, and then Britton and the woman were seen upon the ground together a little from the house. So they were inside drinking, and this guy said, hey, let's go outside, Mary, and make out. And so the other guy saw them outside in the grass making out or having sex. It was reported also that she did frequently abuse her husband, setting a knife to his breast and threatening to kill him, calling him old rogue and cuckold. And she said she would make him wear horns as big as a bull. So she got mad at this old guy sometimes, and put a knife to his throat and called him a rogue. And yet some of the magistrates thought the evidence was not sufficient against her. Some of the pastors said, well, we don't have enough evidence to kill this young woman, to hang her, because there were not two direct witnesses. But the jury cast her, and then she confessed the fact and accused 12 others, whereof 2 were married men. 5 of these were apprehended and committed. The rest were gone, but denying it. And there being no other witness against them than the testimony of a condemned person, there could be no proceeding against them. The woman proved very penitent. So she was crying. She was sorry. And you can imagine her weeping. Please, I don't want to die. I'm so sorry. I'll never sin again. I won't party with these young guys again. I won't have sex outside of my marriage. And had deep apprehension of the foulness of her sin. And at length attained to hope of pardon by the blood of Christ, and was willing to die in satisfaction of justice. Now, as critical thinkers, the person writing this event is a Puritan pastor. And you have to ask yourselves, how much of this is true? Mary is probably really sorry because she's about to die. But do you really think that she was willing to die in satisfaction of justice? This woman's only 18. She has the rest of her life together. So somewhere there's a truth somewhere, but we have to be critical thinkers and not necessarily take John Winthrop's testimony at face value. We have to dig deeper. The man also was very much cast down for his sins, but was loath to die, and petitioned the general court for his life, but they would not grant it. They were both executed. These are Puritans who were following God, executing this young woman for parting with these young guys and having sex outside of marriage. They were both executed. They both died very penitently, especially the woman, who had some comfortable hope of pardon for her sin, and gave good exhortation to all the young maids to be obedient to their parents and take heed of evil company. And then she was hanged. I'll let you read this sermon. Please read it. When you read this, you get another window, or the same window, into the Puritan mindset. So we read John Calvin's foundational tenets of Calvinism, upon which the Puritan religion was based. And we had this window into the execution of Mary and this sermon. You put all these things together and you really get a sense of what the Puritans thought, how they lived their lives, the control that the church, the pastors had, the religion had on their lives. The fear of hell, right? Hell, the idea that every human being is a detestable sinner bound for the fires of hell, come through in all these original sources. John Calvin's ideas, the execution of Mary Latham, and this sermon. You get the idea that this idea of hell was ever present. Well, students, that concludes our brief discussion of the Puritans and Pilgrims and Quakers in the early colonies and what will become the United States of America.